Breaking now. Birmingham is erupting in chaos and the country is holding its breath. Streets once familiar are now battlegrounds. Smoke rises over Villa Park as flares streak the night sky. Sirens wail, police lines crumble, and the world watches as Britain teeters on the edge. Amid the chaos, one voice cut through the silence. Nigel Farage, unapologetic, unflinching, took aim directly at Starmer and the government. His words didn't just criticise, they ignited a storm. The question on everyone's lips, can anyone still control this country? Last night, Birmingham became the stage for a crisis that no one in government seemed prepared for. A football match meant to be a celebration of sport spiralled into a scene of unprecedented chaos. Thousands of fans, flares, smoke and panic collided into an explosive mix while more than 700 officers from 25 forces struggled to maintain order. The barriers meant to separate fans fell like paper. Chaos was no longer a warning. It was reality. And it was broadcast live for the world to witness. People were injured. One woman was dragged from the crowd simply for holding a flag. Arrests were made, but the numbers barely scratched the surface. Across social media, footage of the riots spread like wildfire. The sense of fear, confusion and betrayal was palpable. As the night unfolded, the government's response, or lack thereof, became its own story. For 9 hours, Downing Street remained silent. Ministers were unreachable. The Home Secretary was absent from the crisis, attending a gala as the streets burned. Deputy ministers were nowhere to be found. When statements finally emerged, they were brief, hollow and without direction. 40 seconds of excuses, no plan, no solutions. The people watching weren't reassured. They were enraged. The numbers told the truth. Public trust in law enforcement and government plummeted. 68% of Britons now believe the country is out of control. Only 17% still trust the police. Everyone else, they trust no one. Into this vacuum of leadership stepped Nigel Farage. He didn't wait for permission. He didn't wait for briefings. He went live, every word calculated, every phrase striking at the heart of the government's failure. This isn't leadership, he said. It's surrender in slow motion. His voice resonated with millions, cutting through the silence with the clarity of a verdict. That broadcast alone reached 3 million views within 2 hours. Westminster branded it divisive. The public called it truth. Britain, once a nation proud of its ability to host sport and maintain order, now found itself exposed. The streets erupted because warnings were ignored. Intelligence was buried. Every neglected alert became fuel for unrest. The fallout was immediate. Birmingham wasn't contained. It spread. Manchester followed. London followed. Riot shields replaced traffic signs. Streets turned into battlegrounds and police overtime skyrocketed while patrol coverage fell. The Home Office called it contained unrest, but the footage told a different story. Broken glass, flares and fists clashing with helmets created a visual testament to the failure of leadership. Meanwhile, GDP forecasts were slashed, markets wavered and insurers began pulling back from city coverage. Britain was no longer a predictable market. It became a warning signal for the world. Every delay from the government amplified Farage's voice. Each hour of silence turned into a louder echo. Every briefing postponed became proof of inaction. Farage didn't just comment. He interpreted reality for a public desperate to understand what was happening to their streets, their cities, their nation. He framed the collapse not as chaos, but as the inevitable result of decades of mismanagement and neglect. Numbers and statistics underline the truth. Police recruitment increased by 19%, but street violence surged 22%. Asylum claims soared. Over time, payments for officers rose 68%, yet patrol coverage decreased by 30%. Leadership wasn't about action, it had become performance. Committees replaced courage. Statements replaced solutions. By dawn, Birmingham was under partial lockdown. The military was put on standby, not for foreign conflict, but to maintain domestic order. Helicopters circled overhead. The public could see the proof of governmental fear before officials had the chance to spin it. Floodlights illuminated streets that once symbolised everyday life, now transformed into zones of tension. Meanwhile, Farage went live again, his words simple but devastating. When government fears its citizens, democracy dies. That clip spread globally, reaching over 40 countries. Starmer remained silent, and his silence became a symbol of disconnection. The state hadn't collapsed entirely. It had simply withdrawn from reality. Machines were running, but the human element, the trust, the respect, the authority had vanished. Banks imposed withdrawal limits. Council offices shut their doors. Insurers suspended coverage. Every department echoed the same line: "We are monitoring the situation." To the public, this was not reassurance, it was confession. Leadership was no longer measured in decisions, but in how well appearances were maintained. Farage's broadcast shattered that illusion. 6 words repeated across screens, streets, and social media: "You can't govern what you don't understand." For the first time, people were seeing leadership not as a promise, but as the absence of comprehension. Outside the walls of power, citizens began to act not in protest alone, but in reflection. Veterans stood beside nurses. Teenagers lit candles across bridges. Lines of light stretched across cities like silent testimony to broken promises and neglected duties. Birmingham had never been the cause. It was the mirror. It reflected decades of mismanagement, muted warnings, and the erosion of public trust. Farage's voice became the amplifier of that truth, yet even he eventually fell silent. The crowd no longer needed guidance, it needed clarity, honesty, and evidence that the state still existed beyond slogans and rehearsed apologies. Law remained, but compliance became optional. Power existed, but it commanded nothing. Order didn't return, it transformed into awareness. Awareness that control without trust is fiction. Peace without truth is surrender. The nation was no longer burning, it was remembering. And memory, as Farage implicitly suggested, is the ultimate revolution. Security fences rose around Parliament not to keep people out, but to preserve the illusion within. Statements were met with silence. Apologies grew repetitive. Briefings shorter. The public had stopped expecting leadership. They demanded accountability. Abroad, capitals called for restraint, but they could not see what had unfolded in Britain. This was not political collapse. It was moral, social, and systemic. And Farage? His final broadcast cut through the noise, stating the obvious yet unspoken truth: Britain doesn't need saving. It needs remembering. That line didn't just trend, it became the framework through which millions began to interpret events. Trust in government had evaporated, faith in institutions weakened, cathedrals reopened, not for prayer, but for clarity. Citizens sought conviction where authority had abandoned it. The streets that once gave power meaning no longer listened. Starmer spoke, but the country had tuned out. Farage's speeches ceased, and a new silence spread across the nation. It wasn't quiet, it was awareness. It wasn't fear, it was reflection. Order didn't return, control didn't resume. Power still existed, but only as a shadow. Law persisted, but only as ink on paper. The riots ended, but the reckoning continued. Birmingham, Manchester, London. These cities weren't just epicentres of chaos. They were mirrors of a nation confronting the truth it had long ignored. And in that reflection, one question remained: who will lead if no one will follow? By midday, the streets of Britain were no longer just arenas of chaos. They had become proof of a system unravelling in plain sight. Birmingham still smouldered. Manchester echoed with sirens, and London's bridges were lined with silent witnesses, candles flickering against the dusk as if marking every failure of those in power. Police lines, stretched thin and exhausted, no longer inspired respect. They inspired defiance. Officers admitted privately they would not follow orders they themselves did not trust. Command structures, once rigid and unquestioned, dissolved under the weight of public disillusionment. Starmer's ministers attempted to project calm, but every carefully scripted press conference, every recycled apology was met with suspicion, scepticism, or outright mockery. Farage's words had shifted the narrative entirely. No longer a politician pointing out flaws, he became the interpreter of reality, the voice telling millions what they already suspected: the system was still running, but the government had lost touch with the people it claimed to protect. Farage went live again, his words cutting through a country that had grown numb to official statements. You cannot control what you refuse to understand. It was simple, direct, yet terrifyingly accurate. Across social media, that phrase became a mantra, spreading faster than any official explanation could. Every silence from Downing Street, every delayed briefing, every unfulfilled promise amplified the sentiment. Authority was no longer a guarantee, it was a relic, increasingly irrelevant. Markets responded with caution, the pound fell, investors hesitated, and insurers withdrew coverage for major city events. These weren't just economic ripples, they were the consequences of a leadership vacuum. The people watching on screens, phones and TVs weren't just witnessing failure, they were seeing the consequences of decades of ignored warnings, mismanaged crises and a hollow performance of governance. Intelligence reports, predictive alerts, early warnings, all dismissed, all buried. And now the streets bore the evidence of neglect. Hospitals reported spikes in injuries not from accidents or crime alone, but from confrontations that could have been prevented with foresight and action. Social cohesion strained as neighbourhoods once calm were drawn into unrest, simply by the failure of leadership above them. And in this void of authority, Farage became more than a messenger. He became a symbol. Every word he spoke was a needle pricking the illusion of control, and the public responded with attention, with engagement, with outrage. For the first time, the measure of power wasn't held in the halls of Westminster. It was measured by the trust of the streets, by the response of a nation realising that control without credibility is meaningless. By evening, emergency measures were enacted. Cabinet meetings moved to undisclosed locations. Parliament's doors were sealed under floodlights and security cameras, a historic moment reflecting fear more than authority. Helicopters patrolled the sky, yet their presence felt less like protection and more like acknowledgement. The system itself had retreated from the people it was